Hello, welcome to Japanese Craft Beer Reviews. Every 100 or so beer reviews, I like to review a beer book, and that's what we're doing today. The film critic Roger Ebert once upon a time wrote that the second best thing to watching a movie was reading about it. And I'm not sure if that is actually true for beer. I don't mean watching a beer, but drinking a beer, reading about it. I think perhaps maybe I would put number two, listening to other people talk about it, and maybe third, reading about it, unless it's Michael Jackson, of course, and then that would take precedence. But another wise person once said, if you see a beer, drink it. In other words, don't put it aside, don't age it. And that's probably very good advice in general. But today's book is about just that, aging beer. It's called Vintage Beer, and the subtitle is A Taster's Guide to Beers That Improve Over Time. And this is published in 2014. The author is Patrick Dawson, and it's a slim volume, only 149 pages from the front matter to the index, but it's got quite a bit of information. And so aging beer is maybe a minor but interesting aspect of the total beer experience. Not everybody does it, but I think it's probably one that beer geeks get to later in their beer drinking career rather than earlier. The more experience you have with beer, the more knowledge you have. I think you might get more interested in aging beers rather than drinking them right off the bat. So people often talk about aging wine, for sure, laying it down and that sort of thing, but there are certain styles of beers we will see that can benefit from a year or two or more of aging. And so I'm going to go through this very briefly and explain what's in each chapter. This is, again, I said, a slim book here. He has a very short preface in which he talks about how he came to aged beers, his experience, and he discusses what they call the window of optimal aging for beers. And as we'll see, that the optimal window is different for different beers depending upon what they have and how they were made. So we're going to look at that in terms of each chapter now. And in chapter 1 of this book, he calls it The Aging Beer, and he gives what he calls 14 rules for aging. For example, number 1 rule is the beer should be 8% or above to age if it's not a smoked beer or a sour beer. So the alcohol level must be kind of high. There are 13 other rules that he goes through as well. Chapter 2, he mentions what's called vintage potential, and he talks about which beers we should think about aging and how to choose them. And he mentions the components of a beer, what's components that are linked to the aroma, the mouthfeel, and the flavors of a beer. And he talks about several components. One, of course, is malt, the malt that's used, the hops, and maybe the amount of hopping, the type of yeast, the alcohol level, the wood, if it's aged in a barrel of any kind, oxidation, and microbiota, which means, of course, any bacteria that's been introduced into the beer to age it. The classic example would be Brett yeast. And This chapter 2 is really kind of the heart of the book, and if you, it's the one that should be probably studied more than any other chapter. So it is the thickest chapter 2 as well, and it's probably the one that you really need to get through. So it's about 30 pages of this slim volume. So that's the one that really should be studied. Chapter 3, he goes through the best styles to cellar, and let me quickly stop this. So in chapter 3, the best styles to cellar, and he gives examples for each. And he starts off with English barley wines and old ales as well. And these are separated from American barley wines. And he mentions that 6 to 8 years is probably the optimum for that. And in some cases, 15 years or even more. For example, Thomas Hardy Old Ale. There are vintages of that go quite long. I've had a 20-year-old vintage of that once. And so in American barley wines, a little bit less, 2 to 3 years are probably the optimum. And of course, some can go up to 10 years. But he mentions that they should probably be drunk within a 2 to 3 year aging period. Next is imperial stouts, and there's quite a wide range of imperial stouts based on the malt and hop content. But so he doesn't really give an optimal kind of window for that, but he states that most are better after a single year of aging. Will probably benefit from that. The fourth category is Belgian quads or quadruples. And these are beers that are very high alcohol, generally 10, 11, 12 or more percent alcohol. And he claims that 5 years would be the optimal range for that, but some can go on for 30 years. So, Flanders Reds, and we just reviewed Rodenbeck Grand Cru. Flanders Reds and brown ales can go 2 to 3 years, and some, he estimates, can probably surpass 20 years, but maybe 2 to 3 years is the best. And then the last one is Goose, which go all over the place. Of course, they're great. In chapter 4 of the book, he talks about he gives tasting notes for what he calls classic cellar beers. And he had a panel of tasters who were very well experienced people, and they used the same glassware together for each beer, and they evaluated a fresh version and an aged version of the beers. And I've done this once. A friend brought over some beers for us to drink blind, and we went out of the room, and he poured us 2 glasses, and we sipped them, and I kind of recognized what one of them was, but the other one seemed like a completely different beer. It turns out they were both Rochefort 10, Belgian quad, Rochefort 10. One had been kept in a refrigerator for 3 years, and the other had sat in his genkan, his entryway of his house, which is subject to all sorts of, it's the entryway where the front door is in a Japanese house, and subject to extreme cold and heat and all kinds of things. And that one was not bad, but it seemed like a completely different beer from the one that had been aged for 3 years in a refrigerator. So anyway, the panel of tasters, they rated a series of vintages up to 10 years. J.W. Lee's Harvest Ale for English barley wine, Sierra Nevada Bigfoot for American barley wine, Dryfonteinen Old Goose for the Goose category, Brooklyn Black Chocolate Stout for the Imperial Stout, Rodenbach Grand Cru for the Flanders Red, and then a few others. Anchor Christmas Ale for the Winter Spiced Ale category. Those shouldn't be aged too long. Schneider and Son Aventinus, which is a Weizenbock, and Trappist Rochefort 10, a Belgian quad. So he has very interesting tasting notes on those beers, and talks about how they. He gives another, for example, for imperial stouts, he'll give several other categories as well. Examples. Chapter 5 is one for the real serious geeks. It's selecting your cellar, how to create your beer cellar, and he talks about several important things to consider, and one is temperature. Cellar temperature should be below the fermentation temperature of the beer, and so in case of ales, that would be probably 55 Fahrenheit or 13 degrees Celsius. Light exposure. Hops, of course, are very sensitive to light and will deteriorate over time with light, and so you should have a fairly dark place. Humidity. Humidity is generally a problem for corked beers, and he talks about the problem of ullage, which is evaporation when a cork is kind of dried out and some beer has evaporated from it. In the configuration, he talks about the cool storage space or a refrigerator. So should you use a cooler box or styrofoam boxes for your beer as well. I'm going to bring out some examples of beers I have on hold here. Okay, I want to show you some of the beers that I have set aside here. Here's a Rochefort 10, and this is the best by date for this was 2017, so it's like 4 years past. And this is Saint-Folien Quadruple, which is 11%, and this is fresh, so I'm going to put this away for a couple of years at least. And here's, of course, a classic Westverlateren 12, which is 10.2% Belgian quad, and age on this 2015, so we'll see how this is, of course, used to be considered the best beer in the world. It's I think dropped to number 3 now, maybe, perhaps. And then here is a barley wine. They call it a special golden ale from Hair of the Dog. This is batch 82, 2010, 10-ish around, so it's about 11 years old, maybe past its prime, we shall see. It's one of my favorite breweries in the world. And then this is a Monster Ale by Brooklyn Brewery, and it says this Monster Ale was born in 2004. And here's a Sierra Nevada Bigfoot, which is from 2008, and I think a friend of mine has one from 2006 or 4, and we're going to probably drink these together. Sierra Nevada Bigfoot, an American style barley wine. And here is another one that's fairly new. This is Japanese. It's from Ise Kadoya, and it's American style barley wine, and the alcohol on this is 11%. So I'm going to put this away for a little while as well. And then we get to some other special ones here. This is Expedition Stout, made by Bell's, and they don't put it. I don't have a date on it, but I wrote it when I bought it, so it's 2010, so this has been hanging around for 11 years or so. And then here we go to Mephistopheles, which is from Avery, and this one is kind of supercharged. It's a 16%er, and this one is from 2007, and it's probably ready at some point now. And then finally, here's one which has disappeared for a while, but has come back, and it's a Japanese beer from Asahi. It's Asahi Stout, And this is unlike any other beer they make, completely and totally unlike anything they make. I'm going to put this away. I've got several bottles of this, and I'm going to try them out after a year or so, and 2 years or so. This is 8% stout from Asahi Breweries in Japan. So, well, the last section is called How to Manage Your Cellar, and he gives some pretty good advice. He says buy at least 2 bottles of a beer you're considering to age, and drink one fresh, drink one after a year or 2 or whatever number of years you think is right, or buy a 6-pack and try them off at try them at different times. And he mentions a few ways to find the age of a beer. So sometimes they don't necessarily give you a clear indication of the age, and some European beers have different systems for labeling or noting the age, and he gives some websites that can help you find the age of the beers. And he also mentions like using a spreadsheet to keep the information of your cellar, and a couple of apps that you can use. One is called Cellar H9, Cellar 9, and is that right? And the other is he does have an appendix of outstanding vintage beer bars, and most of the in the United States, so one in Sweden, and yeah, that is it, I guess. The other one is in Sweden. So bars that you can find. He gives 10. He reviews 10 of them and then lists 10 more that you can, where you can find good vintage beer for sale. And yeah, give it a go. If you're into beer, try some of these interesting styles, and then set aside, an example. So, you buy a St. Fulien quad, buy 2 or 3, and put a couple of them away in your cellar and hang on to them. So I would like to do this in a better fashion. In Japan, it's kind of hard to keep things completely cool without a refrigerator, and refrigerators take space. Even my number 1 beer geek friend has trouble with space, and he has a fairly large house. So anyhow, once again, this is called Brewing Vintage Beer, and it's a taster's guide to beers that improve over time. And I'll put a link to where you can buy it, and the ISBN and so forth. That's it for today. Sorry this is so long. Hope you're doing well, and look forward to your presence next time. Bye-bye.